You might not expect a knot of horsehair tied to keep a tent flap from wandering to tell you so much about ordinary affection, but it does. It holds the door steady the way a promise does, not loud, just certain. If you still awake when we reach the rule about which side of the hearth you should face during a compliment, you can subscribe with the same tiny energy it takes to smooth a blanket's corner. Or don't, and let your eyes rest like bowls turned upside down after washing. The lamp is low, the felt is warm, and the camp is almost quiet. A yurt is a short course in how people belong to one another. There is a bed that is also a seat and a storage plan. Saddlebags, which have seen more landscape than most songs, become a dowry when the bags are stacked together and the straps are polished with care. They are not just containers, they are a resume written in leather. A couple lies down where the lattice curves into a privacy made of circles. Outside, neighbors know nearly everything about the horses, but remarkably little about what was whispered under the quilts, and that balance is deliberate. In a world where wind consults your decisions without asking, people learn to keep their weather inside simple habits. The first spouse sets the tent's rhythm, where the cooking goes, which visitors are greeted by which cup, how the door is propped open during long afternoons when trade follows shade. A second spouse may join, and if that happens, the result is not a scandal so much as a schedule. Affection grows by arithmetic in some households, multiplying bowls and cutting chores into new fractions. It is all surprisingly untheatrical. A belt is hung where guests can see it, a signal that the household is formed and functioning, the way a house key on a nail means the same thing on other continents. Dowry travels in horses, felt, and weapons, because love in a mobile life must be parked where it can move again. The elders bless the union with sentences that sound like advice to travelers. Keep your fire where you can see it, and don't let your opinions call your rights. Inside the tent, privacy is not secrecy. The line between public and family is a rule that behaves like a sigh. Boots stay near the door. That is both hygiene and ritual. Screens of felt appear as needed, trained the way dogs are trained to sit. At night, silence belongs to everyone, and it is enforced not with scolding, but with the practical knowledge that tomorrow will ask for legs. Guests do not linger beyond the end of stories. When the host turns the lamp, the light lowers its voice, and the conversation forgets new topics. If two people keep a private grin while organizing saddles, nobody asks. There is tenderness in how the kettle travels. If it is lifted with two hands and set down by one, that means someone is being careful with someone else's patience. The tent is also a museum of the relationship. There is a comb whose teeth are missing on one side because the horse chewed on advice. There is a braid made of wool dyed with onion skins that once tied a girl's hair and now marks a chest where valuables sleep. Affection in this world is practical and daily. It is the act of shaking out a blanket at dawn so the frost falls without argument. It is laughing at the way a puppy regards a stirrup as a moral puzzle. It is stacking bowls so that the smallest one, which belonged to a child who is now taller than salt, ends up on top like a quiet boast. If you want a grand declaration, you can have one, but it will take the form of an extra horse tethered with a good rope or a new awl, customized to fit a preferred hand, or a skin of kumas refilled before it is empty. In other words, love looks like preparation. Etiquette begins where the hearth begins. There is a rule, unromantic and kind, that nobody turns their back to the fire when others are speaking. It keeps sparks and tempers from traveling. Consent has its own grammar. Desire is expressed like hospitality, visible but gentle, confident, without corners. The bowl of fermented milk moves clockwise, nods to the same. If someone says enough, the word belongs to the person who said it and to the next few breaths after. Men who are loud about appetites are regarded the way people regard a horse that insisted alone as which direction is north. Interesting, occasionally useful, generally escorted. When a couple has business that isn't for visitors, Felt screens shape small rooms from air. The screen will learn to stand where a gesture tells it to. A teenager trying to look unbothered will bump into that screen twice in one afternoon, and both times an older cousin will reposition it with the solemnity of a priest and the speed of a fox. The soft law is that curiosity is entertained until it becomes a problem, and then it is employed. Busy hands don't meddle. Food first, talk second, decisions last. This cadence keeps people from making big statements on a hungry stomach. The small jokes in courtship are sensible. A man ties a knot in a bridle and unties it in exactly the time it takes to finish a cup. If he can't untie it, someone else should be consulted about the marriage. A woman haggles over a strap as if it were a camel. If she gets a fair price using just her eyes, she may be trusted with promises. Whispered compliments belong to a third culture, neither private nor public, carried out at the tent door where the air can erase them if needed. Fault happens because people are competent at being people. When it does, the repair is collective and melodrama. Elders speak before tempers do, and their sentences have a length of songs because quick words are too sharp to grip. If a line is crossed, gifts travel instead of knives. A bridle moves across the mat, or a bolt of cloth, or a string of beads that has calibrated many afternoons. This is a bridge back to ordinary. Children are not asked to decide between adults. They keep routines that teach mornings how to behave. Reputation is the court that lasts. If someone has a pattern of failing to listen, their name learns to carry wind where it appears. Settlements look like logistics: who sleeps where, who leads which horse, who holds which memory when a story is told. Jealousy is not an art form, it is a problem of inventory. If two people want the same afternoon of someone's attention, elders spread the week out on the ground and make new shelves for the hours. A belt placed across the mat says pause, not war. There's a lot of pausing. People who cannot pause do not last long in environments where storms own the calendar. Health in this camp begins with timing and the knowledge that bodies have seasons the way grass does. Midwives are logisticians with warm hands. They heat oil by the brazier and prepare clean felt where the wind can't reach, and they update the plan each moment the plan needs updating. Fertility is a conversation conducted between travel, weather, and grain. Spacing children is a craft. Too close and a household stumbles. Too far and the household forgets how to sing to babies. Herbs help, abstinence helps, sleeping arrangements adjust themselves like a patient puzzle. The rule is simple: strength first, celebration second. People know what exhaustion does to judgment. They give themselves a margin. When the herds must move far and fast, couples keep a quiet fast of their own, a small private Lent dictated by saddle sores and common sense. You can tell a household is careful by the way water is allocated. Water belongs to horses before it belongs to baths, which teaches thoughtfulness. Cleanliness arrives in smoke and sand. A handful of sand used well does part of the work soap does elsewhere. Hands learn to be careful with salt, fat, and fire. There is a way to rinse a pot with a splash of tea that wastes nothing and insults nobody. Talismans carry private hopes. A small knot of blue thread lives at the edge of a mattress. A coin with a hole rides on a thong near a throat. These are not parades. They are handshakes with luck. Love is not measured by jewels, but by habits, in any case. A habit endures in a windstorm, while a jewel turns into a story about how you used to own a jewel. Cleanliness without excess does not mean indifference. It means priorities that answer to horses and weather. There are winter methods and summer methods. In winter, smoke is the first defense. Bodies are perfumed with wood and fat, and the vigorous air that arrives under the felt wall. In summer, people bathe in water that has tasted the sun. Hair is rinsed with a logic that satisfies both vanity and prudence. The best comb is wooden, and it has a long friendship with the person who uses it. It is common for couples to comb each other's hair while listing what needs to be done tomorrow. These combings are gentle audits of health. A change in hair is a note to be filed. A new scar becomes a story about a horse who misunderstood a bush. Small amulets are touched, not displayed. A woman will tap one just once before stepping out to meet a caravan, then forget it the rest of the day because work is what really protects. Men carry an extra thong woven by a sister and pretend they do not believe in it, while never, in fact, leaving it behind. There's humor about these things. A teenager's amulet is inspected for excessive optimism, the way you might inspect a first mustache for honesty. Status travels in tents the way shoes travel in hallways. Everyone notices without having to point. If a captive enters the camp, protection happens before everything else. Food and work come first. Names come later when the camp agrees. A woman who enters under another woman's roof does so because roofs are better at teaching than speeches. She will be given tasks that do not pretend to be decorative. Usefulness is the first language here. Nobody insists she feel at home. They insist she be fed and unafraid, which works out to the same thing after a while. There are rules about harm inside a curtain that are not literary. No means we will have words with you outside, and outside in the sentence includes the next, encampment, and perhaps the one after that. Order teaches belonging before desire does, because belonging is the only thing that has ever survived winter. Reputation, again, is the court that lasts. If a man treats a newcomer like a prize, he learns he has misunderstood the prize. She is a person and a worker, and possibly a future aunt. Order is not an argument. It is where you stand while the argument remembers manners. Time does the slow joining that speeches cannot. The girl who arrived quiet learns the names of the horses with the notch in their ear. She laughs too loudly once and then hits the right volume for the tent. Someone shows her how to tie a knot the camp prefers. She begins to carry news instead of fear. There's a moment, weeks in, when she complains about the taste of a particular kumis and then drinks it anyway. That is the day she is kin. Levirate exists in this landscape not as conquest but as custody. When a rider does not return, the tent remains. Its work must not. A brother may keep the household whole, not to collect people like trophies, but to keep the chores married. The children stay where their feet know the floorboards, and their sleep knows the sound of that kettle. The herds do not care about the legal theory of inheritance. They like hands they recognize. In grief there is efficiency that looks like cruelty from far away and like mercy up close. The widow holds in one hand the braid of memory, and in the other the strap of tomorrow, and does not drop either. There are small rituals. A belt is moved from one peg to another. The new place is not quite right, but everyone pretends it is until it is. A knife that used to sleep on one side of the bed for safety learns to sleep on the other. After 3 nights, it stops waking the house. Songs are sung not because anyone feels like singing, but because songs keep a camp from coming apart in places where stitches are invisible. Children do not attend the council that decides anything. They attend the morning that follows and discover that breakfast still happens. The camp keeps its promises because the camp would rather be accused of stubbornness than of forgetting. Daily intimacy in all of this is a kindness built from small, sturdy parts. There is an etiquette for compliments that reads like a recipe, one short sentence delivered near the lamp, no adjectives you can't saddle, an offer to fetch water immediately afterward to prevent the compliment from getting ideas. A wife asks her husband about Amare as if inquiring about the health of a cousin. He answers as if discussing a respected elder, and they both know what this coat is for. A husband learns that a new felt curtain is exactly the same as flowers, but warmer. He says nothing so the curtain can take the compliment alone. Humor survives by living in the corners. An old woman announces that nobody should sing inside the tent after sundown because the gods prefer their music outdoors. Later, she sings outdoors so loudly that the horses remember a childhood they didn't have. A teenage boy practices braiding rawhide and thinks nobody will notice he is practicing for someone's hair. Everyone notices and practices not noticing. It is also human you could fold it into your own cupboards. There are facts that keep peeking in like a polite wind. Women here ride as a matter of course. A man who hopes to impress by theatrically catching a horse will be quietly outdone by a wife who calls the horse with oats and gets the job done sooner. Men here cook more than strangers think they do, especially on long journeys when the only good cook available is the one who's hungry. People sew with great speed. A tent has to be mended before a storm asks for attention. Desire takes the shape of chores completed ahead of schedule. Courtship looks like a freshly greased boot seam or water bladder filled before sunrise. Kisses happen, and we are not going to inventory them. The tent knows. The lamp knows. The neighbors pretend the horses are tremendously interesting. The etiquette is low and unsurprising. You do not kiss in a line of the water skin. You do not kiss within earshot of a mother who just finished explaining bread. You do not kiss a person who is frowning at a kettle. If a rule is broken, the apology involves doing work without being asked, which is both effective and usefully exhausting. Practicality keeps romance from turning into theater. We should acknowledge jealousy because jealousy insists on acknowledgments. It is managed like fire kept small, fed only when useful, never left unattended. When someone's feelings light too quickly, elders divide the fuel. So many days here, so many there, an errand for each party, a visit to a cousin with a horse that won't be shod unless spoken to kindly. It sounds mechanical. It is mechanical, and the machine is kindness. Very occasionally, someone refuses the machine. Then there are meetings that feel like weather reports. The words are basic. You, me, the camp, the children, the winter, the horses, the promises. People come away with tasks. It is almost unfair to jealousy how effective the tasks are. Jealousy, given a saddlebag's worth of barley to carry and 2 goats that must learn a new path, loses most of its poetry and becomes a dull employee. This is the desired outcome. Time in the end is the great teacher and the quiet comedian. Lovers decide they are old when they switch sides of the bed because the new arrangement works better for reaching the kettle. A household decides it is thriving when the dog starts sleeping by preference under a certain blanket that smells like certain shoulders. A girl becomes a woman on a day that ends with her rolling her eyes at an uncle. The uncle is relieved because confidence often begins with eye rolling. A boy becomes a man not because he wins a race, but because he loses one and unties the bridle slower afterward, which is the right speed for life. Elders argue gently about whether a tent should face a degree more east in spring because sun, or a degree more west because wind. The argument ends when somebody remembers the tent faces the direction it faces because it is already staked there. People in this culture like to pretend they are stern. They are practical instead, which is better. If you have drifted a little, that is fine. The lamp is still low, the felt still warm. The camp breathes in its ordinary way. A midwife checks her bag, a father mends a strap. A pair of cousins share a joke so quiet it sounds like thread through leather. There is no final lesson because lessons end and camps must continue. But you could carry this if you like. Affection here is a daily craft made of reusable gestures. Privacy is respected with the same seriousness as bread. Consent is a grammar that people know as well as saddle knots. Jealousy has chores. Grief owns a chair but not the doorway. And love, when it tries to be showy, is gently redirected towards sweeping. Somewhere just now, a woman lowers the lamp, and the tent goes to sleep with its promises intact. And tomorrow, When horses stamp and pots yawn, and children hunt for boots that have decided to be elsewhere, the same people will write the same assurances into the day, slow and practical as a horsehair knot. You might not expect a thin stick of hazel split down its length like a quiet disagreement to change how a kingdom remembered its money, yet a small piece of wood once held the weight of taxes, roads, and royal promises. If you are still awake by the time I get to the bit where an office cleared out old bookkeeping and accidentally redesigned, London as skyline, feel free to subscribe with the same gentle effort it takes to turn a page you were already turning. Or let your eyes close and I'll keep notching details at a pace soft enough to calm his breathing. The tally stick begins with a walk. A clerk in a wool coat pockets a knife and chooses hazel because hazel doesn't splinter when life gets interesting. He finds a straight shoot, cuts it to a hand span or an arm's, depending on the size of the debt, and places the blade where numbers will live. Notches have personalities. A deep V-shaped cut means a pound. A notch of a different depth means a shilling, and tiny feather nicks stand for pennies. He marks them in tidy clusters with silent pride, the way you might arrange teacups by a logic nobody questioned. When the sums look right, he splits the stick exactly along its grain. The knife travels as if following an old rumor. Suddenly there are two pieces, the stock, kept by the exchequer, and the foil, handed to the taxpayer or the sheriff or the miller or whoever is today as protagonist in the story of arithmetic. The two parts match only each other. Bring them together and the notches kiss. Keep them apart and they disagree with anyone who tries to impersonate them. It is low-tech twin-factor authentication, and it is beautiful in the way things are beautiful when they work without explaining themselves. People who like paper will wonder why not just write it down. Paper in early medieval England behaved like an occasional relative, admired, pricey, and never where you put it. Parchment was respectable but slow. A tally could be made in a field in winter, with a knife that also trimmed quills and apples. Wood knew how to keep a secret in damp weather and tell the truth in dry. The exchequer adopted tallies for taxes, rents, fines, and any other reason a crown could devise to move coins from pockets into chests. Receivers brought foils on market days like honest keys. In the counting chamber, a table covered with a checked cloth exchequer, the chessboard received coins and questions. Clerks set counters on the squares, pushed them in little diagonals, and made decisions with the calm of people who prefer rules to moods. When a foil was presented, its partner stock came out of a bundle tied with thongs. The halves met with a satisfying refusal to lie. They matched or they did not, and when they did, numbers slid into ledgers with right angles and good grammar. If you listen closely, you can hear a clerk exhale the small sigh of someone whose system has justified itself again. The stock stayed with the treasury, a wooden spine that remembers everything. The foil traveled back to the holder, proof that a debt had been paid or would be paid, a passport issued by arithmetic. It could be handed to another person in payment, and now that person had a wooden sentence that read in a language of grooves. The exchequer will accept this. Money is trust performing cartwheels, and the tally let trust keep a steady gait in muddy boots. Sticks for small sums were naturally small. A village might share a handful of foils the way people share scissors in stories. Great debts require grander lengths, which is to say, longer sticks and deeper notches, and also more dignified faces while cutting them. There were rules, of course. The notches had to be cut before the split, because otherwise the halves might not tell the same truth. The grain must run the long way, so the stick could grow old without turning philosophical at the edges. The best clerks could read a bundle of tallies by running a thumb along the cuts, the way a blind reader feels meaning. On a slow afternoon, a clerk could close his eyes and name a county by the scent of its wood and the cadence of its debts. Some microfacts drowse pleasantly as they pass. The word stock, the thicker half kept by the exchequer, is the reason we call company shares stock. A shareholder once owned a slice of a promise that split and matched. A foil, the thin half, is why a companion or counterpart can be called a foil, the one that returns the shape. When a debt was cancelled, some offices bit the end off the stick and chewed it into splinters without looking sentimental. Other offices kept everything forever and tied the years with string, stacking them until string became the most important supply item after coffee, which hadn't been invented yet but was in spirit present. In the 13th century, sheriffs wore foils at their belts like respectful bric-a-brac. A sheriff who jingled more than necessary was said, softly, to be efficient. A sheriff who jingled less than necessary learned to visit London in winter. An economy of wood produces furniture for the imagination. Imagine the exchequer chamber in April when the sheriffs came up to account. It is not glamorous. It smells of wet wool, ink, coin metal, and the indefinable scent that follows nervous travel. Foils are laid out like small portraits. The stocks wait in bundles that have opinions about gravity. Masters of the tallies glance, match, and nod. A new clerk whispers the legend of the checkerboard table to himself. Squares for pounds, squares for shillings, little diagonals for mistakes forgiven. A senior clerk corrects a tally by biting off a miscut notch, which sounds dramatic and is merely dental. Add in a low joke about a county that always arrives with muddy edges, and you have the workplace humor of a tax state that runs on precise boredom. If you are feeling awake enough for a tiny metaphor, the tally stick is essentially a tree learning to speak in accountant. If you are not feeling awake enough, the tally stick is a stick. Centuries pass. Kings change, coins change, but tallies persist because when something works, it takes generations to persuade a government to stop enjoying it. Even when paper floods in, tallies still excel at receipts given in barns and lanes. They are hard to forge without a tree's cooperation. Duplicates are obvious. The green won't mirror itself for a liar. Villagers keep foils alongside keys and needles. A foil, like a song, is part of a household's equipment for being less worried than yesterday. In country courts, a tenant presents a foil as calmly as a baker presents bread, and the steward nods as if greeted by an old friend. In monasteries, where good filing systems go to feel appreciated, pouches of foils are labeled in a hand that looks like someone tipping their hat. The practice survives plagues, dynastic rearrangements, and fashions in wigs. It endures because it is simple, portable, and compatible with bad weather. By the 18th century, tallies are old-fashioned enough to be invisible. That is when they achieve their greatest trick, which is to cause a fire by being retired. In the early 1830s, officials finally decided that centuries of wooden bookkeeping should not be a permanent interior design choice. The stocks in the exchequers, vaults bundles upon bundles, tied by reins and by counties and by the slow opinion of dust, were to be disposed of, a phrase that never knows its middle name. Paper had won, and wood needed to politely go. The clerks chose the heating furnaces under the House of Lords as a convenient method of farewell. A messenger fed the old tallies into the grates with the earnestness of someone who likes a tidy shelf. The stoves glowed with nostalgia, but wood that has stored promises for 500 years does not burn like ordinary wood. It burns like a reunion. Chimneys coughed. Sparks loosed themselves in the flues. A fire found the furniture of law. In October 1834, the old palace of Westminster burned with alarming grace. People watched from bridges as two towers argued with flame about which one loved air the most. The next day, London had a famous ruin. Later, London had a famous new building, because the loss of the old cleared the way for the Gothic masonry and spiky silhouettes that visitors photograph and pigeons admire. A tidy act of office cleaning had nudged history's elbows. The irony napped for years before waking in footnotes. England's new parliament rose partly because officials disposed of an obsolete memory system too enthusiastically. If you like very soft jokes, you can say that accounting redesigned architecture. The moral is not that tallies were dangerous. The moral is that retired systems should be treated with the same care as retired officials, kindly, slowly, and not in a furnace under an important roof. Newspapers of the day blamed the flues, the stoves, the weather, and one unhelpful gust. A clerk blamed himself by becoming silent. Tallies finally finished with their work of matched ash with air, and left their last notch on a skyline. Long after their practical life ended, tally sticks kept talking in small, stubborn ways. Museums hold a few, and people lean toward the glass as if listening for figures that never made it into ledgers. A stick marked for the Sheriff of Yorkshire is unexpectedly beautiful. Clean-cut notches, old polish, the soft bruise of handling. Another, scratched with a date, looks like a calendar that enjoyed privacy. Antiquarians explain to dinner companions that notches aren't random. They confess they once tried to notch a ruler and made a map of disappointment. Words remain. We still use stock and stockholder, stock-taking and stock-still, as if wood kept sitting in our sentences, refusing to leave the exchequer of language. In some alpine villages, notch sticks continue to track milk deliveries and bread until living memory. A dairyman's score stayed tucked behind a shelf, smelling faintly of both agreement and cheese. On the Isle of Man, fishermen kept split tally rods for shared nets. Two halves reunited at season end over a table that was sometimes also the season's gossip. Each culture finds its way to a quiet ledger you can hold. The logic of splitting a truth into two matching halves turns up elsewhere like an old friend changing hats. Lovers have broken coins to carry halves. Soldiers have done the same with medallions, and the treaty world invented duplicate seals and counterseals because wax enjoys company. In Japan, wooden vouchers called kaiuchi-jai once recorded loans with cut. In China, bamboo tallies known as fu served as credentials that rejoined like shy fish. Everywhere, systems that suspect the weather create tokens that disdain ink. It is all a long conversation between trust and geometry. The tally's geometry is domestic. A straight line, a handful of grooves, a satisfying sound when pieces reunite. The trust is domestic too. You and I meeting with something small to prove that our last meeting happened the way we remember. If you lean your head toward a fire and half close your eyes, you can hear the rhythm tallies taught clerks. Cut, check, split, keep, match, nod. That rhythm seeped into other places. It moved into how markets balance books on Fridays and how friends square small debts without writing anyone. S-name on paper they might resent later. It even informs the way we close tabs in our minds. You have your half, I have mine. If the halves meet someday, good. If not, the green will still say what it says, whether or not we are in the room. The world, which is large, prefers these tiny assurances. A promise should be portable and weatherproof and a little bit dignified. A stick fits into a sleeve without insisting on pockets that didn't exist yet. Let the details soften further. A clerk in the 14th century, bored but loyal, whittles a dragon on the blank end of a stock because dragons are easier than patience. Another clerk scolds him for artistry and then borrows the knife because the dragon is rather good. A sheriff on a wet road keeps his foils in a leather case that smells like arithmetic and horse. A widow uses an old foil as kindling with the contentment of someone who never had to present it again. A child plays with the offcuts and invents a game called Treasury, which is identical to pretend cooking, except the soup is coins and nobody eats them. A judge hears the clink of coins, the whisper of counters sliding on the checkered table, and the soft rasp of two halves returning to each other after a season apart. These are small sounds in a loud century, but small sounds keep the day organized. Modern offices do not use tallies, except when a whiteboard says tally in a meeting that was long before it began. Yet the urge to split and match survives in screenshots of receipts and in QR codes that wink like futuristic notches. Two halves of a truth still want to align. When you scan a boarding pass and the gate flashes green, you have performed a ritual invented when a hazel stick decided to be precise. Somewhere a systems administrator bites the end off a miscut notch in metaphor. Somewhere else, a programmer, eccentric and joyful, names a database table exchequer and a colleague smiles, which is what footnotes look like in offices. If you are drifting, the stick will hold the place for you. It has been holding places for 1,000 years. It knows how to attend without fuss. The details you missed will be where you left them. A tree chosen for honesty, a blade that understood grain, a table with squares, a clerk whose sigh sounded like a page turning by itself, a city accidentally refounded by old bookkeeping going home through a chimney. You can sleep while the exchequer matches because matching is quiet work. And later, when you wake to a modern number in a modern app that assures you a payment cleared, you might feel the smallest gratitude toward the long ago wood that taught governments a calm way to remember, a way that fit in a hand and refused to lie, a way that burned brightly only once and then let the world get back to counting. You might not expect a loop of iron no wider than a thumb to be the reason. A poem survived a winter, yet a small ring riveted to the spine of a book decides who reads it, who borrows it, and who remembers to put it back. If you are still awake by the time, I explain the shelf that is also a lectern, that is also a custody agreement. Feel free to subscribe with the same quiet ceremony used to turn a page without letting the candle sputter. Or don't, and let your eyes do what monks advise parchment to do. Lie still and absorb the light. Tonight is about chained libraries, which sounds dramatic until you see them. Then it becomes a room full of whispering furniture and metal that behaves like manners. A chained library begins with a key that nobody actually uses. The key is the rule. In a house of books that took a century to copy, the rule is simple. Books stay. Not forever, not never, but until the librarian says they don't. So a blacksmith and a binder converse. The binder stitches quires with thread thick as patience. He glues the spine and covers it in wooden boards, then leather. He leaves a square at the head of the backboard where the blacksmith's work will live. The smith makes a ring, then another, and sometimes a small hasp that looks like an opinion. The ring passes through a staple, the staple through the board, the ends clenched inside. It is not pretty, exactly. It is function wearing a dark hood. The chain is a queue of links the length of an arm and a half, long enough to turn a page and short enough to keep the page from walking. The last link ends in a swivel because knowledge, even restrained, likes to face the reader. Some chains are round like gossip, others square like instruction. A good chain learns to lie politely on a desk without coughing in the margin. Shelves in such a library are not exactly shelves. They are benches with spines up and four edges out because the chain attaches to the backboard, and the back should be near the iron bar that runs like a sentence along the front edge. This means the titles, when there are titles, stare at the wall, which is the kind of joke furniture makes when it knows it is in charge. You identify a book by its clasp, its color, and the way it smells of oak and dust in the last reader's sleeve. The bar is locked at one end, not to make stealing impossible, but to make it ceremonial. If a book must travel, a bishop borrowing Augustine for a sermon, a physician needing a herb manual with drawings that know the truth about leaves, the librarian unlocks one bay and performs a small theater of permission. He writes the title on a schedule that thinks in feasts, not dates. He notes the borrower's name as if noting a weather change. He relocks everything so it will forget how to argue. People imagine medieval libraries as caves of prohibition. In daylight, they are surprisingly friendly. A chained book does not forbid you, it invites you to sit. Desks are built like low windows with elbows in mind. The chain snakes to the edge, swivels, rests, and waits. A reader who stands to stretch leaves the book open on its belly, which bothers nobody because bindings then knew how to lie open without complaining. A student frowns over a page, tracing letters not because he can't read, but because the scribe's hand, all barbed angels and disciplined corners, is music that enters better through the finger. Margins grow small households, pointing hands called manicules, faces that look like cousins, a note explaining a puzzling verb with the tenderness of a cook annotating a recipe for a future daughter-in-law. No one hurries. The chain does not measure time. It measures reach. If you find that comforting, that is the point. There is a rhythm to the day. Morning light arrives with the authority of a bell. The librarian, who has the same number of pockets as an ocean has buoys, checks clasps with a touch that is part blessing, part inventory. He oils hinges with something that smells like nut and winter. He knows which chain kinks when scolded, which bar hums when you breathe near it, which desk will invite naps before matins and after Compline. A visiting scholar, his boots confessing the weather he brought in, asks for Gregory on job, and the librarian finds him the copy with the quietest glosses, because some days a reader needs the text without the village. A novice sneaks glances at a bestiary while pretending to consult a psalter, and the chain, indifferent to ambition, simply lets the lion stay where lions have stayed, since lions were invented in the border of a page. If you listen long enough, each link has a clink like a particular vowel. E binds a little sharper than a ao is round and obliging. E sighs. Absurd facts drift him like motes. At Vuffen in the Netherlands, books were chained so assiduously that even after printing made them cheaper than a good hat, the iron stayed because habits are reluctant furniture. At Hereford, you can still hear the soft pride in a guide's voice as they tell you the chain length in inches, because measurement is a form of reverence. Some libraries chain the catalogs themselves, a sight both philosophical and pragmatic, the index, like a sensible parent refusing to let itself be misplaced. In Italy, desk chains were sometimes long enough to cross a narrow aisle, which means there exists at least one record of a monk announcing he has been ambushed by the Summa. The Renaissance did not rush to unshackle. Even humanists who like their letters dressed in laurel understood that a book is a winter, worth of candles and copying and mittens with the fingertips slit, and you don't leave that to chance and charm. Every 30 or 60 seconds, some tiny strangeness amuses. A chain polished by hands does what iron rarely does. It warms. A monk learning Greek whispers the alphabet to the tune used for beekeeping. A dean, uneasy with a marginal drawing of a rabbit jousting with a snail, adds nota in a stern hand, thereby promoting the duel to permanence. Someone calculates the cost of a single volume by adding vellum ink, thread clasp labor housing, and the one indulgence of a red initial, and then shrugs, because the total is more than a horse and less than a roof, and equal to the feeling of being able to find the same sentence tomorrow. The chain makes small sounds. The reader makes smaller ones. A draft sneaks under the door and reads nothing but bothers everyone. You can follow a bookstay the way one follows the sun across a room. Morning. A canon consults law with the bitterness of a man revisiting an argument that the law already won. The chain lies patient. Noon. A lay scribe hired for his good Latin copies a page with the steadfastness of someone paid by the line. He drinks a little ale. His handwriting relaxes into a more sociable width. Afternoon. A physician comes with a student to duty read a passage on humors and decides out loud that black bile has been slandered. Evening. A child of the choir assigned to dusting lingers over a page of birds, reads the names as if they were relatives, and adds one careful dot beside the sparrow because the sparrow came closest to listening. Night. The desk's empty with a sound like permission returning to its seat, and the librarian does the last little lap, securing clasps that prefer to wander and speaking aloud to the room the way a gardener speaks to tomatoes. Books like to be told they're doing well. Not all chains were iron. Rules also chain. Borrowing in a college might require a bond, that is, another book left hostage, or a coin amounting to the scribe's patience. The pledge could be as strange as a silver spoon that knew more gossip than forks do. In some towns, a volume might be loaned to a guild on condition that the guild keep it chained in their hall, which resulted in splendid hybrids. A medical text that smells of wool, a sermon book that knows how to dodge beer. Chains, in other words, multiply custody rather than merely restricting motion. They anchor books and communities the way bells anchor time. If you think of the chain as the sentence, "This belongs to us and to those after us," you will not be wrong. Printing complicates the picture like spring complicates a coat rack. Suddenly, there are more books than iron bars. Chaining them all would turn the library into an unhelpful aviary. Some chains are retired quietly. Others persist because certain titles still cost a pound of the future. A chained Bible after 1540 is not just a book. It is a civic appliance. In parish churches across England, the Great Bible is set out in English, chained so that scripture cannot be carried off by zeal or accident. People gather to read it aloud to each other with the new car smell of vowels never assembled in that order before. Sometimes the readings become debates, which become sermons, which become scoldings, which the chain addresses by being the only participant that remembers to be calm. The metal does not choose a side. It chooses a place. There's a gentle comedy in how long the furniture holds its habits. A Victorian librarian writes a pamphlet against chaining as if he were protesting corsets, citing hygiene and the injury to bindings, then builds a locked case that behaves like a chain wearing a tuxedo. A 20th century curator installs velvet ropes around a case displaying a famous manuscript, and the rope thinks, privately, that it is the grandchild of a common iron bar and is proud in a quiet, itchy way. A modern museum gift shop sells a tiny charm in the shape of a book chain, which no one buys to prevent theft, and everyone buys to promise themselves they will keep what they love near enough to touch. Why chain at all? Asks the part of the brain trained by doorbells and delivery drivers. The answer naps in the margins: scarcity, labor, and the inventiveness of loss. One cow makes a few sheets of vellum if the scribe is clever. One scribe makes a few pages a day if the weather cooperates. One book travels across centuries if dozens of readers decide it should. The chain makes that decision visible. It says, "We keep this here so that when you come back thirsty, you will find the same well." It says, "We think future you is more real than the man who would tuck this into his cloak today." It says, in iron, what caretakers say in kitchens: "Put it back where you found it, and you will find it where you put it back." The chain is a lullaby sang to an object that would otherwise elope. There were, of course, escapes. A chain snapped by a determined knife leaves a scar on a desk that librarians can read the way trackers read mud. A book returned with a different chain is like a dog returned with a different leash. It raises questions about the walk. A storm teaches a roof new behaviors, and water teaches a chain to remember rust. A fire does what fire does, and the iron survives to accuse the air. Somewhere in a chronicle, a note records a theft so politely that you can hear the scribe trying not to sigh. Someone writes, "Hoc librum furitus est," so and so stole this book, which is the medieval equivalent of subtweeting, and the chain, silent, agrees. Consider the ergonomics of reading while tethered. Your chair finds the angle that turns a long page into a small journey. Your hand learns to escort the chain out of the way with the tenderness used to move a cat. You discover the particular grace of balancing a folio so that gravity, not your wrist, does most of the work. The book teaches your spine 3 tricks you will use later in life when balancing: a sleeping child and a cup of something that pretends to be hot. The rest prints your cuff in a half moon that looks, to a friend, like a bruise earned in an argument with history. You smell iron all afternoon and like it. A good chain is a vocabulary word for the body. After 3 days, you forget it, and after a week, you would miss it if it were gone. There is a data story here if you need one to keep awake. The chained library is a living index. Desks nearest the window hold texts that prefer daylight, natural philosophy, calendars, herbals that identify plants with green that never fades, because green pigment did not sign the contract that yellow did. Desks in the center hold theology that needs no sunlight to argue. A corner bench holds the book nobody admits to liking, usually a compendium of penances, carved with as many abbreviations as sins. The position of a book becomes a statistic. A smudge at the bottom right corner tells how often a hand steadied a page before the turn. A threadbare patch on the chain's felt sleeve announces a long romance between one title and those who chose it. If some clerk were to keep score, and one always does, he could forecast the season, us interest by the chorus of small noises, the clatter of links near law in autumn when rents are due, the soft traffic at the Salters in Lent, the sudden popularity of a grammar after a new teacher assigns too many lines to memorize. Knowledge makes weather, the chain's record gusts. Micro hooks keep appearing like shy cats. A friar who never learned to write his name draws a fish as his borrowing mark, and the fish begins to swim through the ledgers year after year. A boy tasked with dusting invents a system for letting the chains down slowly so they want to slap the wood, and the librarian pretends not to notice he is training a future librarian. A tall visitor stoops to read a low book and leaves with a particular ache that explains why chiropractors were invented later. A nun in a distant priory ties a small ribbon to the end of a chain, so it will stop bruising the book S4 edge, and ribbon becomes standard not by decree but by charm. In one cathedral library, a cat is paid in food for services rendered to mice, and the receipt survives. The chain, unimpressed by cats and mice alike, supervises both with the neutrality of iron. Eventually we arrive, as we always do, at the present tense pretending to be the future. You, with your phone that chains you to every library and nun, stand before a glass case and read a sign that explains how the book used to be chained. You tilt your head and the chain in the case tilts with you because the swivel still knows its job. You take a picture, which is the most modern form of custody agreement. You notice the ring's scar where a reader's ring once tapped it, wetting iron to gold and tiny sparks for decades. You imagine the long hand that copied the page, a hand that dipped, shook, breathed, and found its way from margin to margin without getting lost, and you understand that the chain did not constrain thought. It preserved a location in which thinking stayed findable. If all you carry away is the idea that containment can be a gift, the room will consider you a good borrower. By now, the candle in this story has burned low and the iron is cooler to the touch. The librarian does what librarians in every century do, closes the distance between book and home. Clasps click with the small confidence of a chore finished. Links rest. Desks rediscover their grain. A draft ambles in to inspect the work, approves, and leaves. No one thinks the chains out loud, which is fine. Their feelings are famously robust. You may drift. The room will keep its cargo until morning, when a new reader with a new silence will sit where you sat, pull a book toward the edge with the same reaching motion people have used for 600 years, and learn something familiar. That knowledge anchored is easier to approach, that slowness is a form of courtesy, and that a simple loop of iron, doing the same humble task for so long, can hold not just a book, but also the temper of a whole room. If sleep finds you now, it will not be theft. It will be a return, like a chain swiveling back to its quiet place, like a page deciding to lie flat, like a thought remembering where it belongs. You might not expect a lamp wick and a saddlebag to tell you how people loved each other, but in the Haunted camp they do. One giving light and the other holding dowry, both quietly practical. If you are somehow still awake by the time I reach the matter of belts hung where guests can see them, feel free to subscribe with all the ceremony of turning down a corner of felt to mark a page gently and with every intention of forgetting you did. This is an oddly precise subject, and that is the point. The Asian Hun world did not speak about romance as a thunderclap. It talked about the pace of a day, the angle of a brazier, and whether a belt lay on a peg or a bedroll. The words for affection were packed into ordinary habits, the way a tent line hides inside grass. So we begin not with theories, but with the small objects that made a household. A belt that said guests were welcome, a loop of hair tack that said a writer was home, a wooden bowl paired with a second bowl because 2 spoons are quicker than bargaining over one. Low lamps revealed the bedroll first, because a bedroll that can be packed is a more honest biography than a mattress that cannot. 2 boards in the chest held saddlebags, and the saddlebags held more than travel. They kept the small archive of alliance. A bride did not simply arrive. She traveled with horses and cloth and perhaps a little iron, and each of those objects pointed back to kin who would ride if riding became necessary. The first spouse who settled into the tent. There is always a first spouse in a camp where families expand like braids, set the rhythm. Which side of the hearth felt like morning, which like evening where visitors would place gifts, and where the quiet space would begin after boots were left. When people say privacy, they often mean secrecy, but here it meant a line you could point to, even if the line kept moving with the felt curtain. The belt hung where guests might see it was not decoration. It was a sign that affection and goods were arranged, that hospitality had an order, and that the tent would never confuse a meal with an argument. Daily life is the softest ledger. In the thick of winter, screens of felt turned air into rooms. You could hear the brazier mutter against fat, you could hear the pot negotiate with water, and you could hear the small conversations that made closeness ordinary. Did you check the girth stitch? Put the bow out of reach. Yes, the Mari has opinions. Children learned the rule before they could name it. Family space began where boots were left. Elders did not preach privacy. They practiced it by letting night quiet belong to everyone. When a lamp was turned so its light minded its business, it meant desire had a schedule, and the camp would respect it. Spectacle did not have a calendar here. Closeness did. 2 bowls, a low lamp, and a belt, and you've described the architecture of a household more accurately than any epic. Etiquette lived where the fire lived, and the fire had geography. The host never turned his back to the hearth when speaking to a guest, because heat and honor both benefit from facing outward. A partner never turned a promise into pressure, because tomorrow's ride likes a calm start. Food first, talk second, decisions last. This was not prudishness. It was weather sense. When you live by sky, you plan by fire. Kumis traveled clockwise, not because the world would end otherwise, but because a drink pass predictably calms a tent. A nod could be enough, which is a useful lesson for tired people in every century. Desire moved in the same measure as hospitality, and that is far less mysterious than it sounds. The shared rule was comfort without danger, visible, calm, and not required to be confessed. Lovers did not own the tent any more than guests did. They borrowed it from the camp for an hour and then gave it back in good condition. Jealousy, when it came, did not bring knives. It brought elders. Lines were crossed, as lines always are, by an extra visit, an unannounced gift, a boast that outpaced common sense, and then a settlement turned feelings into furniture. A belt, a bridle, or a bolt of cloth crossed the mat to mark the repair. Not because things can heal hearts, but because a visible object helps a rumor stop running. Children kept their routines. Adults traded words instead of wounds. The reputation of the tent, which is the only courtroom that matters when your town is capable of moving, survived by teaching people how to remember. Memory here liked lists. Who brought what? Who apologized with what? Who promised which schedule for future visits? If this sounds boring, that is the wisdom. A calm tent outlasts, temper the way a braided rope outlasts an unbraided one, by refusing to be interesting at the wrong time. Health and timing belong to logistics. Midwives warmed oil by the brazier and cleaned felt where wind cannot reach. This is not poetry, but insulation strategy. Spacing children was a practical art, measured not by shame, but by animal numbers, travel plans, and season. When the herds moved far and fast, couples kept a quiet fast of their own. When the camp lingered near rivers, the calendars listened along with the earth. Distant watchers may imagine romance as an emotion unhitched from carts, but the camp hitched everything to carts, even kisses. The rule was simple because simple rules are easier to remember and so. Strength first, then celebration. The work of the day yielded to the body's needs in the evening, but the body's needs yielded to the herd in the morning. This is not coldness. It is consent with a map. Cleanliness in a place that travels looks like a sequence rather than a room. Water belonged to horses before baths, which would disappoint a modern person with a shelf of soaps and please a mare with opinions about the weight of buckets. Smoke and sand did what they could. Salt, fat, and fire did the rest. Hands learned to be careful while skin learned to be honest, because winter has a way of telling you the truth. Small amulets, bone or coin or a tuft of hair braided with a thread, carried private hopes and stayed out of sight. You touched them rather than displayed them. Comfort came from habits, not luxuries, and habits are very good at outlasting wars, diets, and fashion. If you've ever slept better next to a list you cannot remember writing, you understand the wool and felt version of intimacy. Status matters even in a tent, but it does not announce itself with marble steps. It announces itself with a new name given slowly and a mat set aside. Captives complicated the whole subject of affection, and the camp handled it with work first, safety second, and naming later. A newcomer could not be kin simply because someone desired it. The camp had to agree, and the camp agreed by watching who shared labor and who returned tools. Order forbade harm within the curtain, and the rule had teeth because breaking it would cost the camp more in reputation than revenge could repay. Desire in this geography learned patience from winter. It learned that kindness is louder when it is ordinary. Over months, sometimes years, new names attached to old people, and a household widened by approval rather than conquest. The law of the camp was neither a scroll nor a code. It was the path 100 feet were thin on the way to the same hearth. Loss had its own grammar. When a rider did not return, the tent remained. Work must not. The household could be kept by a brother, not as possession, but as custody, which is a word that should be embroidered on more banners than it is. Children, herds, and memories stayed in one circle until winter found them ready for change. Widowhood was not defined by silence. It was defined by whether the camp would let speech become a promise again. Levirate arrangements, practical, sometimes tender, sometimes merely cooperative, made sense to a society that counted wealth in legs and patience in miles. The lamp lowered and the curtain drawn were not the end of affection. They were a way of telling promises to remain intact while people figured out how to keep living with them. If any of this sounds unromantic, try living by sky for a year and see what you start calling love. Every little while, some small fact wanders in and refuses to be dramatic. A gift of horsehair rope knotted into a loop could carry a vow longer than a poem. A pair of braided belts hung together on a peg told more truth to a visitor than any story, and also told the visitor where not to step. A brazier placed a hand's breadth closer to the bedroll meant either the night would be cold or the talk would be long. Either way, no one announced it. A bride's envoy related to everyone by the second cousin map that lives in the human head knew both households well enough to adjust the strap, moving what might have been an argument back into balance. People who live in houses think walls hold privacy. People who live in tents know that voices and smells are democratic, so courtesy must do the work walls do elsewhere. A nod, a turned lamp, a belt on a peg, that is the architecture. If you listen for humor in the camp, you will find it where work meets shyness. A couple learning each other's habits will tease about who snores like a tired yak and who counts steps in their head. An aunt might place a pillow exactly where a nephew will trip in order to remind him a tent is also a home. A novice horseman will try to impress a would-be spouse with a flourish and end up teaching everyone the difference between a flourish and a tangle. Laughter belongs to the evening. The camp does not let it wander into dawn, because dawn has labor to do and laughter is a poor harness. Even so, a braided ring of grass quietly placed in a bowl says what cannot be said aloud while relatives count saddlebags in the corner. One of the more curious customs is the public face of a private schedule. Meals arrive with predictable order: grain, meat, drink, and then the camp behaves as if a bell has been rung somewhere beyond the horizon. Guests know when to retire by the angle of the embers. Elders know when to tell a long story, which is also permission granted to those who need the story's length for their own purposes. The thresholds in this culture are not doors, but tempos. Desire that keeps time with the camp is praised not for being passionate, but for being considerate. If you want a modern comparison, think of those apartment buildings where people learn without speaking, the hour when shoes are carried instead of worn. It is the same courtesy in another costume. In a society where property moves, inheritance is a choreography lesson. A dowry is not weight, it is usefulness. A mat counts if it can be rolled. A pot counts if it can be hung from 2 different hooks. A belt counts if it can hold a knife and also a hand. The more a thing can do, the more affection it attracts. So marriages are less about combining fortunes than about aligning schedules and tools. The wealth of a union is the speed at which 2 people can take down a tent together without stepping on the same rope twice. This makes for a thoroughly uncinematic version of intimacy. 2 silhouettes, 1 coil of rope, a shared joke about which stake always hides, and then the camp asleep while hooves whisper a mile away. If there is a soft theology of love in the hum camp, it is built from repairs. Stitching a torn felt panel teaches more about fidelity than any oath. Replating a rope teaches how to borrow strength from a neighbor's string. Sanding a saddle bow where a knee has polished it too much reminds everyone that even good habits must be adjusted. People who live with wind in their teeth treat desire as a good tool. Boil it, store it wisely, use it without shouting at it, lend it carefully, and thank it when it helps you lift. Sometimes a scholar will demand numbers, as if the camp kept ledgers of kisses. The answer's numbers of a different sort. The times a bowl is filled for 2 before anyone asks. The steps moved by a bedroll during an illness, so the patient can hear the horses nearby. The number of saddlebags placed between 2 people when they need a conversation with handles. The calendar keeps its own domestic feasts. The first thaw that lets you wash all the blankets, the first storm that makes you grateful the belt. Hangs within reach the last day of summer when every household tidy-up looks like a dance practice all winter. What passes for scandal here is mostly logistics done out of order. Someone drinks before a guest arrives and is teased by everyone. Someone forgets to turn a lamp, and a child politely does it for them with a look that says, "We all live here." Someone brings a gift too dear for the occasion, and an aunt downgrades it on the spot by wrapping it in common cloth, solving in moments what a city might litigate for months. Gossip is not ignored. It is assigned chores. Give it a rope to coil, and it loses interest in chewing on people. We should visit softly the edge where law meets loss. The levirate custom, which pairs a widow with a brother of the deceased, is often told as rule first and feeling second. In practice, it behaved like a careful punctuation mark. It stopped a sentence from breaking in the wrong place. It reassured children that beds and bowls would not go wandering. It reassured herds that the hand with the particular whistle would still arrive at dawn. Sometimes love came later, sometimes not at all, but the camp respected arrangements that worked, because winter respects nothing else. And yes, there were refusals negotiated the way tents are, quietly with "we" placed here instead of there, with an aunt's voice slightly louder than a young man's, with a compromise that felt like a mat laid down in a better spot. If you are still awake, and if you are not, may your sleep travel like a horse that knows the path. Notice how little of this relies on grand declarations. The camp believed in arrangements because arrangements survive snow. It believed in hospitality because hospitality turns enemies into people who owe you the memory of tea. It believed in gifts that could be used again tomorrow. Its romance was a neat coil of rope, a belt on a peg, a lamp turned sideways. Somewhere among the horses and the pots and the felt, two people learned the shape of each other's. Patience and the camp, which is to say the entire village on the move, allowed them the time and space to do so in peace. This is not a moral, but a lull. The fire settles. The belt hangs like a small, quiet promise. Somewhere a child falls asleep to the rhythm of hooves and breath. The tent is not a castle and does not wish to be one. It is a moving room where people practice keeping each other warm without announcing it to the step. And when the lamp is turned so its light minds its business, the camp goes on breathing its careful, durable courtesy, which is as close as any place ever gets to love that lasts the weather. You might not expect a single length of hemp rope to explain how a whole town decided when to wake, eat, pray, and stop selling onions for the day. But in the Middle Ages it did, with a polite thud of metal and a very long sigh of fiber. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part about tar, please feel free to subscribe the way a sacristan closes a ledger slowly, without looking directly at the page, and with every intention of opening it again tomorrow at the same smudge. Tonight's topic is monastic bells, not the dramatic ones that announce kings or fires, but the steady bells that told bakers when to knead and told geese when to be surprised. It is a small subject ideally suited to sleep, a loop of rope, a wheel with wooden teeth, a tongue of iron called a clapper that seems far too eager for its job, and an impatient raven who lands on the soundboard as if it were his desk. The story begins in a field, which is a very monastic way to begin. Rope wants hemp, and hemp wants soil that holds water like a memory. Villagers sow it in long strips behind the orchard wall, and monks checked the seedlings with the same concern they gave to psalms that wandered off-key. A good bell rope likes a long fiber, the way a careful sentence likes a long breath. When the stalks rose and the leaves decided they had been green enough, the harvesters pulled the plants by the roots and tied them into sheaves that looked like the whiskers of a very large cat. Retting came next. The bundles soaked in a pond until the gum softened and the field began to smell, like a mix of old bread and quiet ambition. There were always arguments about exactly how long to ret, which is a polite medieval way to say people guessed, then pretended not to dot. After the pond came the break, the scutching knife, and the hackle, a small arsenal of wooden jaws and iron combs that could turn a stalk into a ribbon and your patience into a new theology. Long fibers went to rope, short fibers to cloth, and the chaff to any hen who wished to give her nest an air of industry. A monk with a talent for knots, every monastery had one. Usually a man who remembered weights and measures better than names twisted fibers into yarn. Yarn into lays, lays into strands, and strands into a rope with a gentle spiral that persuaded hands to trust it. He checked the lay by sighting along it like an archer, and then rubbed it with a tallow and ash mixture that smelled like winter. Someone annotated a margin, 2 turns more than you think, which is still good advice for many subjects, including lids on jars and the question of whether to say what you are thinking, while the rope cured on pegs. The bell waited in its timber cradle, a metal fruit and a wooden tree. Bells were cast far away by men with soot in their hair and grammar that favored verbs, but monasteries treated them as local citizens. Each bell had a name and a job. The big one, with shoulders like a barrel and a voice that found you even behind a wall, handled the hours. The medium one, dignified and slightly proud of its pitch, called chapter meetings and made the traveling merchants look up with an expression that meant, "Ah, yes, time is happening." A little bell, sometimes no bigger than a generous soup pot, announced the porter, the infirmary, or the arrival of someone who made the gatekeeper use his polite voice. The clapper in each bell was not the bell itself, which is a useful thought when you are considering statements that sound louder than they are. Ringing is an unglamorous geometry. The ringer does not yank. He persuades. The rope descends through a hole in the ringing floor, passes through a loose knot that stops fraying, and ends in a sallia woven grip, striped like a barber's pole, fluffed to welcome tired hands. Inside the frame, a wheel holds the rope along its rim. Pull, and the wheel urges the bell to swing. Release, and gravity does all the thinking that needs doing. The trick is timing the second pull so the bell's momentum becomes a conversation rather than a disagreement. New ringers learn the hard way, which is to say, the rope leaves their fingers with the same confidence a goose shows a stranger. Old ringers let the rope teach. Listen, they say, and then do not say anything else for a while. Meanwhile, the sacristan records everything, because a monastery without lists soon invents them out of weather. He writes that prime must be audible at the mill, that vespers must not start until the lambs settle beside the wall, that on market days the bell for none will be rung twice because traders pretend to forget the first time, that on the day of the parish fair the small bell will be muffled with a strip of cloth, so it does not sound like an argument about apples. He notes that frost makes a high note sharper, rain fattens it, fog eats it, and snow, when it arrives like a tired pillow, makes the big bell sound as if it has put on a wool cloak. The sacristan is not a poet, but his margins are full of weather that behaves like people, and that turns out to be almost the same thing. A bell rope ages the way bread does, slowly at first, suddenly later. Tallow helps, tar helps, a leather sleeve helps the place where the rope rubs against the floor. Mice like rope during an ambitious month, but leave it alone when the cats hold committee. Pigeons admire the belfry, but do not contribute rent. The lay brother assigned to discourage them learns the art of stern murmuring. The wheel squeaks in Advent and is repaired with a mixture of oil and flour, which would also be a passable pancake if anyone were foolish enough to try. The clapper develops a flat where it meets the bell lip. An ironsmith files it until it behaves again. Visitors ask the obvious question, why not simply strike the bell with a hammer? And the ringer smiles because people always confuse what sounds simple with what stays true. We should pause for the schedule, which is the quiet spine of the whole enterprise. Matins in the night, lauds at dawn. Prime when the light decides it truly meant it. Terse mid-morning when bread has stopped being interesting. Sex when shadows are short and opinions long. None during the drowsy stretch when even bees consider a union. Vespers at evening. Compline when the world wants to yawn without being rude. Each hour has a pattern, a handful of strokes. A pause long enough to count to the number required by some rule, remembered mostly because it has been obeyed. Then a final toll that suggests a door closing but leaves it ajar. Towns learn these timings the way feet learn a familiar road. A baker starts kneading on the second stroke at prime. A smith begins cooling billets at the pause in sext. A child measures a secret race by the distance between vespers and compline and wonders why time always wins. There are micro laws that delight sleepy minds. On windy days, the bell pulls itself, and the ringer merely prevents scandal. On still days, the rope is heavier than anyone remembers, an excellent metaphor for weeks with too much counsel. On feast days, the bell is rung with joy, which translates into a flurry of strokes like birds startled from a hedge. During funerals, a strip of cloth is tied near the clapper's crown to soften the strike, muffled peals that sound like the world putting a hand on its own shoulder. When the bishop visits, the bell speaks a complicated sentence learned from an older monastery. No one is sure what it means, but it sounds obedient, and some meanings are mostly tone anyway. Because monks are practical, they train spare ringers the way sailors teach knots, by letting them make exactly the mistakes that will soon stop entertaining anyone. A novice pulls too hard, the bell lifts unruly, and the rope leaps as if it belonged to a different story. A senior hand places 2 fingers on the sally, less command than presence. "Feel the return," he says, and then they both stare upward as if hearing a bird that has not yet arrived. There is occasionally modest theater. One veteran ringer tied a thin thread to his wrist so the rope could kiss it at the exact moment the bell wanted him. People asked if the thread was magic. He said yes and refused to specify further. Another kept a pebble in his pocket that he turned 3 times between the Ave and the Gloria because it made him stop thinking about lunch. Monastic technique is full of such small superstitions that are really just strategies for telling the body to behave. The bell itself, if you lean your head against it, hums like a very asleep beehive. The metal remembers every strike. The lip is polished by years of being told to speak. There are inscriptions, prayers, names of donors. A crick line commemorating the year a dry summer made the grain short and the tempers long. Someone once scratched a tiny fish near the sound bow. No one knows whether it meant a fast day or a fish. Perhaps the scratcher simply liked fish. Medieval certainty is overrated. What matters is the bell's voice, which is a sustained vowel more than a note. A reminder that most of life is one long syllable with a moving center dot in towns with more than one bell. The choreography grows intricate. 2 bells rung together can say, "Come quickly," or "Come politely," or the prior requests, not commands, depending on spacing. 3 bells rung as a rising set makes a festival announce itself, even if the weather looks unconvinced. There is an especially lovable pattern called the drunk sexton, recorded in a margin by a mischievous clerk. It consists of a big bell rung with the solemn spaces and a little bell inserted 1 beat late, suggesting someone who is trying very hard to be helpful. It was emphatically not used in public, or so the margin says. Dot maintenance has its own soft drama. The ladder to the belfry is older than any opinion about it. Splinters know every hand by name and hold no grudges. 1 rung creaks in a way that the community uses as a clock. When it creaks, you are halfway up, which is exactly when you begin to regret going. Spiders do not sign leases, but have firm ideas about corner rights. Bats attend vespers in the summer, whether they intend to or not. Woodworm loves the soundboard, and so the carpenter argues back with vinegar, patience, and the occasional new plank slipped in as if it had always belonged. Crews haul up new ropes with old ropes, a pleasing loop of history using itself to continue. Dot bells are polite to seasons. In spring they sound optimistic, which is to say slightly surprised and willing. In summer the air carries them farther because warmer air enjoys gossip. Autumn fattens the sound, as if the bell has eaten good bread and wishes to share. Winter makes the note exact. Snow is the best acoustician. After a storm, a village can hear its bell as if it were standing inside it. And there are accounts of shepherds smiling at a tone arriving across a white field. Like a ladle poured from heaven's kitchen, a scriptorium, where monks copy books, is close enough to hear the bell, but far enough to pretend it is not the most interesting thing happening. Scribes make tiny drawings and margins to record particular remarkable peals. A bird wearing a cowl, a bell with feet, a rope that becomes a dragon. When a visiting scholar insists on asking whether time began with bells or bells began with time, the librarian pours him watered ale and answers with a story about a bell found in a bog, which is the historian's way of reminding people that answers improve with P. We must also mention rules for crisis, which are extremely soothing if you do not have a crisis. Fire requires fast, narrow strokes, no flourish, lots of urgency. One of those moments when the little bell stops being sweet and starts being effective. Flood means long strokes, separated by long silences, which is also a good way to breathe while carrying sandbags. Lost child is a pattern the town invents, and then hopes never to use. A scribe writes it down anyway, because writing down a thing is a spell that keeps it away just often enough to make it feel wise. Money creeps in, because it always does, and it arrives wearing a cloak labeled repairs. Bells crack, and the repair is expensive. Parishioners donate coins, not for noise, but for reliability, which is the bell's best virtue. A benefactor sometimes insists on a motto stamped in the metal. A popular one translated loosely as, "I speak so you do not argue about when." Another, more sentimental, said, "I call the living. I lament the dead, I break the thunder," the last part being optimistic metallurgy. But people enjoy courage cast in bronze. A thrifty abbey once commissioned a bell that was slightly too small for pride and exactly the right size for usefulness. The community loved it as if it were a sensible ant. The town learns to hear subplots. At dawn, the baker counts strokes, adjusting dough with a confidence that will later taste like crust. Children playing in the lane stop mid-chase during sex, not because they are pious, but because even games respect a big voice saying breathing time. Market bargainers talk faster before none because everyone knows the line will disappear under the bell. This tradition has not died and shows no sign of considering it. Shepherds on the hillside use vespers as a rope. They wind it around their thoughts and head home without needing to look at the sun. Lovers meet at Compline because the world is quiet then, and it is pleasant to have an accomplice with a bronze throat. There is, every few years, the ceremonial lowering of a bell. It is the sort of event that sounds exciting and becomes a masterclass in waiting. Ropes tangle with opinion. Beams move as slowly as good advice. Everyone holds their breath not at the dangerous parts, but at the almosts. When the bell finally rests on a stout cart, the town touches it the way people touch a sleeping animal, with intimacy and an agreement not to wake it. The founders chip and polish and pour new bronze into the wound, a metallic surgery performed by men who whistle exactly the same phrase over and over, the way all surgeons do whether they admit it or not. If there is a secret to monastic bells, it is not their sound, but their permission. A bell lets you begin without proving you are ready. It lets you stop without defending your fatigue. It gives a shape to ordinary courage, the kind that picks up a tool at the same hour for years and calls that rhythm life. People like to say bells call, but often they console. You are not late, they say. You are simply in the middle of something. Finish your line, wipe your knife, put down the broom. We will wait one more breath. Our rope, which has been so patient, returns to the hand that started this night. After years, it will be turned into smaller lengths for the kitchen or the stable. A bit will tie back pea vines, a bit will hold a door, a bit might become the child's skipping line. Ropes retire into smaller usefulness, which is a nice ambition for any of us. A new rope will arrive, faintly sticky with tar, clean with purpose, a little too hopeful. The ringer will take it in both hands and feel along the lay as you might trace a familiar sentence. The bell will test it with a doubtful nod that sounds very much like the first note of prime, and so the day keeps its shape because a metal fruit swings in a wooden tree on a rope that once stood in a pond trying to become itself. The monks consider their office done when the sound is honest. The town considers its chores begun when the sound is familiar. Somewhere a raven clicks its beak at the echo, unimpressed and absolutely present. The rope rests, the wheel rocks, the clapper thinks about tomorrow. If you have drifted, let the next stroke be someone else's concern. Time is being kept by patient hands, and they do not mind if you miss a few of the notes. You might not expect a string spun from flax to decide when a whole street yawns, eats, and stops pretending to read, but a candlewick did exactly that for a few quiet centuries. If you're still awake by the time we get to the account book where somebody itemized half an inch of evening, you may subscribe in the same manner a snuffer caps a flame politely, without hurry and with the faint smell of beeswax on the air. The history is simple enough to be restful. Fat becomes light. A thread learns to burn with decorum, and ordinary rooms arrange themselves around a slow, golden clock that can only count down the day begins in the places that make night possible. In one town is the tallower's yard, which is a tidy sort of chaos. In another is the bee yard behind a wall of old brick where the lavender leans like a neighbor sharing news. Tallow does the heavy lifting of illumination because cattle are generous with their endings, and people like economy that arrives in herds. The rendering kettle is big, black, and a little philosophical. Into it go offcuts from the butcher, suet with its patient marbling, stray trimmings that smell like the practical side of winter. Heat persuades fat to confess. Water separates workloads. A wooden paddle teaches everything to agree. On cool days, the mixture frowns and needs more time. On hot days, it smiles and needs less. A boy with a long ladle skims scum the way librarian weeds duplicates without triumph, with method. Beeswax belongs to another temperament, where callow is democratic, wax is aristocratic and slightly sticky. The beekeeper cuts cappings from honeycombs and warms them gently as if soothing a nervous letter. The molten wax clarifies through cloth. The scent is a memory of flowers that forgot to leave. If you hold a cake of wax to your ear, you can sometimes hear a phantom hum. This is not supernatural. It is the sound of your expectations being indulged. Monasteries light wax for their altars, guild halls for their meetings, careful households for their best room where nothing ever happened urgently, tallow for bulk, wax for ceremony, and in between, mixtures tailored like soup, a little of this to keep the smoke modest, a little of that to discourage droop. The recipe is always enough, which is a precise measure when you've done it for years. A candle without a wick is a sermon without a verb. The best wicks are not strings so much as strategies. Flax is redded in ponds that pretend to be ponds and are actually schools. The fibers graduate into threads that twist right or left, depending on which hand did the thinking. True wick is a flat braid that curls as it burns, presenting its ash to the flame like a student with an answer. Russia's humble marsh plants serve the poor as rushlights, a pithy inner core dragged through fat and persuaded to pretend to be a candle for the length of a simple task. They burn with a sideways enthusiasm and deposit tiny remarks on the furniture. There were candle wicks twisted from cotton in port towns where ships brought ideas wrapped as textiles. A household might keep a skein of wick in a drawer with a good tablecloth next to the flint and the steel, because convenience likes neighbors. Dipping is the lullaby of manufacture. Take a bundle of wicks hanging from a rod like a row of well-behaved mice, dip them into the vat, lift them into air that thinks about being cool, walk a slow figure 8 while they set, and then repeat. Each round is a sentence. 10 sentences make a paragraph. An afternoon fills a ledger with tidy columns of future evenings. The shape thickens the way patience does, quietly, evenly, without commentary. Apprentices count dips aloud until they learn the feel of one more. The room smells like warm dairy and duty. In winter, candles harden with a briskness that suggests standards. In summer, they require compliments and shade. Molded candles are the confident cousins, Wick threaded through a tin tube, warm fat poured and left with a towel over its head, the result a cylinder with ambition. A good mold makes candles that stack neatly in a box labeled later. Wick trimmers come later, though the stories often put them first because tools have charisma. The scissor ends clip mushrooming carbon before it can sputter and gossip on the ceiling. There's a tiny pan on one blade to catch the crumb of burnt wick. Some trimmers add a light hook for coaxing the flame into better posture. The whole device looks like a piece of wit that decided to be useful. Snuffers, tall and conical, resemble party hats for endings. Children asked to do the snuffing because being in charge of darkness feels like a promotion. Somewhere an ant keeps a taper slender, polite, dipped many times into beeswax to carry flame from one life to another. Fire is not shared. It is loaned, but people are kind about returning it that by the time a candle reaches a room, it is already half history. The room arranges itself around the flame the way a cat arranges itself around a patch of sunlight. Books tilt toward it, hands slow in order to stay inside the small geometry of brightness. Shadows admit they are part of the furniture. Economists of the household arise, the person who decides the evening spend measured in inches. 1 inch for sewing, half an inch for mending that should have been done in daylight. 2 inches for reading that feels like a holiday. 1/4 inch for the final cup when the day pats your shoulder and says, "Enough." In one 18th century account, you can almost hear the sigh as a clerk writes, 1 3/4 of an inch wasted in conversation, which is, when you think about it, a generous way to describe company. ***. Time by candle does not click. It settles. In more than one hall, a candle is marked with pins or lines like a very patient ruler. The pins dropped as the wax surrendered, making a soft clink that told a meeting it had met enough. Scholars set candles behind glass cylinders etched with hours. The flame climbed the marks with the seriousness of a student, though drafts made it honest in the way weather is honest. A midwife kept a stub beside her herbs to measure the space between pains when night was being practical. Sailors learned how much of a watch was left by the distance between their thumb and the next strip. In some towns, an evening school teacher charged by the thumb, which is proof that education has always had feelings about funding. Candles have ways of misbehaving that are privately endearing. A guttering flame lays down a trail of wax like a pilgrim who has decided to be remembered. The trail hardens into a formation children call icicles and adults call untidy. A tunneling candle burns a well through its own middle, proving that even light benefits from guidance. A candle that spits is announcing a quarrel with an impurity, usually a crumb of something that cannot mind its manners. A candle that smokes is asking for less wick or more patience. A candle that leans is pointing toward a story. Superstitions grow the way herbs do, without asking permission. Blow out a candle and a wish gets 2 chances. Pinch it out and the room hears your good sense. Snuff it with the bowel and the last curl of smoke carries a tiny message to whatever place keeps old flames. There were rooms where candles learned languages. In the hall of a guild, the candles spoke business in rows, then banquet in clusters, and finally, we are tired in stubs. In a church, they spoke Latin, whether anyone else could or not. Wax pooled around brass prickets in shapes that map makers would have enjoyed. In a poor cottage, a single rushlight spoke enough to find the spoon, and then bowed out with a confidence that looked like cheer. The same light can mean different things depending on the height of the flame and the size of the hunger. That is one reason inventories read like poetry. 6 candles for Christmas, 4 for the courting, 1 for the storm that talked at both doors. Lighting a candle has its choreography. Flint and steel kiss, tinder accepts. A spill or little sliver of wood ferries the spark upward. The first moment of new flame is shy. The second is proud. The third is useful. Children are told to put a hand above the flame to feel the column of warmth, the invisible architecture that explains how moths develop opinions. Guests remark on the color. Beeswax burns a soft, polite yellow. Tallow prefers a working man's white with a hint of earnest smoke. A mixture will compromise like a town meeting. Lamps, the cousins of candles, glide into the conversation carrying olive oil and good posture, but they are for another evening. Tonight the candle keeps us, which is a phrase older people say when knights do their best work. Markets depend on candles. In a way, markets are not eager to discuss. Winter trade happens in rooms that would be opinions without light. A ledger is honest only when you can see both columns. A signature takes courage best delivered by a flame that minds its own business. Candles mark debt and hope, bought on credit in November, paid for by lambing in April, counted into a dowry with the comb and the linen, promised to the church in exchange for a miracle that will almost certainly be redefined as time and ointment. Smugglers drop a stub into a pocket because it is always sensible to carry a little future. Inns charge for fire and light separately because hotels, regardless of century, practice itemization as a sport. There is also the candle clock of conversation, a technology common to kitchens. Put a fresh candle in the middle of the table. Begin your talk. When the line of light reaches the mark you scratched with your thumbnail, be kind and sleep. People invariably ignore the mark when the soiree is good and pretend not to when it isn't. The candle doesn't mind. It rewards earnestness with steadiness and impatience with drips, which is remarkably like a good teacher. Households develop techniques to be thrifty without feeling scolded. Pinch the wick just after you snuff to reduce smoke and preserve the better part for tomorrow. Save ends in a jar. On a rainy afternoon, melt them together to make a democratic candle composed of everyone's lost minutes. Insert a nail near the base, and you'll gain an extra quarter hour when the wax has nearly completed its thoughts. Paper screens, the ancestors of lampshades, coax more reading out of less burning, a kindness to both eyes and purse. Candlesticks tell on people. Brass holds fingerprints in a hopeful way. Pewter keeps secrets. Wood forgives the occasional bruise from enthusiastic cleaning. A weighted iron candlestick dissuades cats. None of this is controversial, which is a relief. *. Travelers carried little folding lanterns like modest theaters. A single candle performed behind horn panes scraped thin until they admitted light as if it were family. The lantern kept the wind from developing a personality. A ferryman kept one by the oars to persuade the river not to be dramatic. Night watchmen wore their light in a metal bucket with slits, which is a fashionable way to admit that you were in charge of noticing things. Country doctors kept a candle in a pocket that also contained confidence. Soldiers learned how far a flame travels over snow and made plans accordingly. Everybody, high or low, knew the sudden hush a candle makes when a door opens to the weather. Of endings, there are several kinds, all of them polite. There's the snuff, decisive and quiet, which leaves a thin column of gray gossip curling ceilingward. There's the puff of blown air, quick and theatrical, suitable for birthdays, saints' days, and promises too fragile to bear a bell. There is the bare finger pinch, which is more tradition than necessity, and brings grandmothers running with advice about saliva and bravery. Some nights the candle ends itself with a small blessing called self-snuffing, a final puddle that drowns what it created, which is circle enough for any philosopher. The stub goes into the jar of useful ends or into a drawer with buttons that hope. For second careers. There's one more constituency to name. Moths, who are famously clumsy philosophers, hold conferences around candles. They arrive, argue with heat, leave unintentionally, and write nothing down. Soot leaves little memorials above flames, delicate fans like the breathing of a sleeping house. The ceiling keeps them as a diary of winters. Children draw faces in them with a finger and then deny doing so. Dogs are agnostic about candles. Cats understand them perfectly and will not say, "At last the candle is a short column, a suggestion of itself." The wick, once braided with plans, is a crook of black curled like a question mark, answering its own question. The light has done the simplest good thing many, many times. If you are awake still, let your eyes follow the way the last flame beads glassy on the wax, then thins, then makes the gentlest blue, before it decides to keep the rest for tomorrow. The room remains in its place, which is the candle's final kindness, to remind you that darkness is not a change, only a return. There are clocks that tell you how loud the world is, and there are clocks that tell you how kind it can be. A candle is the second sort. It accepts your inch of reading, your half inch of mending, your quarter inch of deciding not to speak. It wastes itself in a way that feels like company. The wick you watch burn is the same wick that measured a chapter, buttered a conversation, and waited while you thought about nothing with the seriousness you have earned. Blow it out if you like, or tip the snuffer gently and let the smoke make its small, warm question mark in the air. The night understands either answer, and the remaining wax will remember where you left off. Asterisk. You might not expect a silent column of rock by a dusty road to keep better time than most people, but a Roman milestone did exactly that, counting distance the way a sleepy metronome counts measures. It looked like a short board pillar that preferred minding its own business. Still, it told couriers when to stop arguing with their horses and told pedestrians when the next loaf of bread was statistically probable. If you're still awake after I describe the Latin way of abbreviating emperors into tidy gravel, feel free to subscribe in the calm way one ties a sandal strap without hurry, with a small nod to future journeys. The trick is that a milestone is not really a stone. It is a decision hardened into geology, and those tend to stand around long after the empire has gone to bed. The morning scene begins in a quarry that does not know it is making calendars. Workmen tap wedges into grooves. The rock sighs and becomes cooperative. Blocks are shaped into cylinders because circles have a way of getting along with travelers. A scribe of stone, the lapidarius chalks letters on the fresh surface so the carver won't forget that the emperor's names come first and that no one truly remembers the exact count of their surnames anyway. The measurements are careful enough to make geometry feel seen. Diameter roughly the span of two open hands. Height a little taller than a serious goat. Base squared to keep the cylinder upright in a hole that is exactly the same hole in every province, which is proof that bureaucracy can be gentle. Lime is mixed, the post hole is honored, and the pillar is introduced to its forever address with a ring of pebbles that look witnesses at a small wedding. The inscription is the part that gets all the attention, though it was designed for glances, not reading. Names stack like short shelves. Imp Caesar DVF August. This is both biography and whisper. Then something practical. AB Herb XX meaning distance measured from the city that believes itself the beginning. On local roads, the numbers count from a market town that is merely confident. Sometimes the carver slips and puts the wrong numeral. It happens. No one is fired. A new line is squeezed in. A chip is pasted back with mortar and stubbornness, and the world proceeds. A milestone is a paragraph that forgives. Around midday, the road itself explains why the stone matters. The via is not one thing. It is a sandwich. At the bottom, trenches and ditches drain the weather's opinions. Above that, a bed of big rocks keeps the road from learning to swim. Then layers of smaller stones, gravel, and sand argue gently about compactness until they agree to be a surface. Ruts appear in time, and carts follow them because that is what ruts are for. Somewhere a surveyor stands with a groma across of strings that refuses to argue and sets a line that becomes a habit measured in miles. A Roman mile is 1,000 paces of the double-step sort, which means 2 strides counted as 1 thought. You can pace a mile with beans in your pocket, moving a bean from one hand to the other every 100 paces. I mention this not because it is useful, but because the person who invented it was pleased. Travelers notice milestones the way people notice clouds, constantly, without commentary. Couriers time their horses by them, swapping mounts every 10 stones if the horse is telling the truth, every 8 if it is secretly a poet. Farmers lean their backs against them while pretending to repair sandals. Children stack pebble shrines at their base and declare the arrangements to be cities that do not tax. Geese use them for shade, a decision they arrive at collectively and without debate. Soldiers measure punishments by distance, run to the 4th stone and back, which is a tidy blend of exercise and geographic awareness. A vendor of figs chooses the 5th stone from town for a stall because buyers arriving there have crumbs in their beards and room in their hands. The stone says nothing, which is also a kind of hospitality. By late afternoon, the maintenance teams drift along. One man carries a brush made from twigs to remove lichen that would like to be literature. Another touches the letters with a dab of red pigment that sun and rain will ignore within weeks. But the gesture matters, like ironing a shirt before sitting down. A third person checks the plinth for wobble with a small wedge of hope. They clear the ditch so winter has somewhere to sit. Sometimes they reset the distance because a landslide moved a section of road 3 paces to the west during a storm that had strong opinions about geography. It is illegal to use a milestone as a hitching post for oxen, but the fine is payable in laughter, so everyone pays on time. The evening scene belongs to messengers, those librarians of wind. They tick off stones like beads. Their minds do arithmetic without announcement. 3 milestones to the bridge with the Huron that pretends to understand Latin. 1 beyond that to the inn where the stew remembers salt. The stones are a map made vertical. They help travelers feel the world is counted and therefore finishable, which it rarely is. A pilgrim measures penance in milestones, telling beads made of geology. Someone promises to abstain from complaining until the next one, and learns how long a vow can comfortably last. A runaway goat chooses the space between stones to stop being a runaway. A couple meets at the 4th milestone, outside town because that distance is long enough to feel decisive and short enough to be reversible. The stone keeps secrets with mineral competence. There are micro-customs, tiny as straw, that accumulate around the pillars like drift. People touch the carved emperor's name for luck because he is unlikely to object. Runners spit beside the base and step the same foot forward every time because that is a ritual that costs nothing and uses no storage. Country folk stack flat stones on top, and if the pile remains in the morning, they call it a sign that the road agrees with them. A magistrate marks the location of a memorable weather event on an otherwise polite margin. Here the snow surprised us in spring, which is not official, but neither is most of living. If someone tips a milestone over, the road workers stand it up again with soft scolding and a little song. It is said not widely, but said that the man who tripped over the 2nd stone, while thinking about olives, invented the first standard olive jar. Proof that inconvenience can be useful if given a base and a number dot. It is easy to forget that these stones were part of logistics more than romance. Carts carrying bricks for aqueduct piers counted them to calculate pay, because payment by road is easier to check than payment by effort. Tax collectors measure how much wear the road admits in a year by how often someone complains between the 7th and 8th, because that interval includes a hill that thinks well of itself. The army uses milestones the way doctors use pulses. From this stone to that stone, we are 20 minutes slower, they say, and the engineer nods and adds gravel to a list. In winter, officers send parties to repaint numerals in black. against the pale of frost, so divisions will not lose their place in the world's sentence. There were, in one province, 2 milestones that accidentally shared a number for 20 years because a flood had the manners of a prankster. No catastrophe followed. People simply counted twice, which made them feel prosperous down at night, the pillars a darker dark. Owls sit on them and practice administration. A fox scratches a private message on the soft base, and another fox reads it with interest the next day. Travelers pass by as formless whispers, and the stone keeps track, adding them into silence. Some milestones were caps of small bronze ones, a fashion that did not survive weather, but lives on in the way older men think they remember it. A storm breaks, and rain ladders down the letters, turning emperors into temporary rivers. In the morning, you can trace the path of each drop by brightness alone. A boy asks what the letters mean and is told they mean, "You are nearly there," which is the most useful translation anybody gives for any inscription. Most days, because the empire was good at being everywhere, milestones learned to adapt. In the mountains, the stones are shorter and squatter, with bases that distrust gravity. In the plains, they are taller, because horizons enjoy company. In sandy provinces, the inscriptions are set within deep grooves to survive the caress of wind. On islands, the numbers are sometimes accompanied by small anchors, a joke that the sea pretends not to notice. When distances are awkward, mile fractions appear halves, quarters carved with the same seriousness as whole numbers, though no one brings them cake. In crowded city approaches, the stones stand closer together but keep their composure, like patients in a polite queue. The uniformity is comforting without being stern. The differences are thoughtful without asking for applause. Centuries turn like pages, and milestones take up second careers with the same patience they gave their first. Farmers adopt them as gateposts because a post that has already stood against an empire can be trusted to discourage a sheep. Churches borrow them for thresholds, which means everyone's foot learns to read by accident. In one town, a baker uses a fallen milestone as a bench where customers wait their turn and pretend not to watch loaves being persuaded from the oven. The old numerals sit under flour like ghosts doing sums. Graveyards find the stones useful because a carved name is a carved name, and marble is marble whether it was boss or cousin first. Even today, in more than one hedge, you can find a cylinder of ancient punctuality doing modern anonymity with grace. Antiquarians arrive eventually with notebooks and affection. They sketch the stones as if taking family portraits. They argue about whether a stroke on a V is original or the invention of a lichen with ambition. They measure heights and depths at what was once buried. They decide that a particular tilt indicates an ancient frost heave, and then decide it indicates an ancient cart bump. Then decide to have lunch. An old woman selling plums by the road calls them the men who asked the stone to speak Latin again, which is accurate and not unkind. Sometimes they rescue a stone from being part of a cowshed and move it to a museum courtyard where it learns to listen to school children, a language surprisingly similar to rain. Local tailies stick to milestones like burrs. A stone is said to whisper a warning on foggy nights, though it is more likely the warping of sound among hedges. Another supposedly counts lovers who promise things they can keep, though the numbers offered vary by century. A particular pillar on a hillside is called the listener because shepherds swore it could hear the sea, which it could because everything can if the wind agrees. There are, inevitably, stories of haunted stones, but they are lazy ghosts, the kind that simply ask you to walk on the opposite side for no reason and thank you if you do. These are not frightening. They are a way of saying the road has opinions and appreciates cooperation. Most of the time, the milestone is just a stone and enjoys being exactly that dot. What we call milestones were not always stone. In places where wood was plenty and carving tools were friendly, There were timber posts, sometimes shaved into four faces like reasonable gentlemen. They lasted until insects filed reports. In snowy regions, people tried tall, painted poles, so winter wouldn't pretend that roads didn't exist. The paint faded into a memory of itself, and passersby learned to navigate by remembering where the paint used to be. In deserts, Karen stood in for milestones, small piles refreshed by each traveler, an acknowledgement that direction is not a fact, but a conversation. Even there, a flake of pottery scratched with a numeral might sit on top to satisfy the Roman urge for tidy counting. Systems love redundancy. Travelers love reassurance. Stones love weather. The arrangement has worked for a long time. If you kneel next to an old pillar and rest your palm against it, you feel nothing special, which is perfect. It is only coolness and small chips, warmth where the sun remembers, and agreeing to find a mind. The letters are shallow from centuries of rain that preferred other work. You can fit a fingertip into the D of DV and then the O of AVG, as if the alphabet were a set of small rooms. A snail may be climbing the shadow side, slowly mastering Latin. A grass stem leans against the base and pretends to be a column in miniature. The road hums, now cars, then carts, then sandals, then hooves, then quiet. The stone does not change speed. There is a modern habit of calling achievements milestones, as though progress were a road and life a courier service with decent sandals. It is a tidy idea and not wrong. The original stones, though, did not congratulate. They simply persisted, the way a kettle persists on a hearth. They let you know that moving forward was measurable, and therefore less bewildering, and thereby easier on the feet. They were the empire's way of saying, someone has counted this. So you can think about something else, about figs, perhaps, or a line of verse that refuses to finish. That is a kindness that needs no empire to excuse it dot by the time evening settles. The milestone is just a darker stripe against dusk. If wind comes, the carving fills with shadow and becomes legible again for a few generous minutes. The way lines on an old hand rise when the light knows what it's doing. A beetle explores the base with professional attention. A traveler adjusts his strap and decides that the next stone is far enough for today. The pillar says nothing. It is good at it. You walk on, measured, unhurried, with the calm knowledge that the road understands its own length and will lend you a small, steady fraction of it before bed. Somewhere behind you, on an old cylinder, an emperor's name watches the last light thin into evening. The stone remains at its post, calming quietly in a language that is mostly silence, which is, at this hour, the most useful kind. You might not expect a small slip of paper to tell time, count value, and settle arguments, yet a receipt does all three while pretending to be shy. It waits until the very end of a transaction, like a cat that joins the party only after everyone has put on their coats. If you're still awake by the time I reach the part about the standard width of receipt paper rolls, feel free to subscribe the way a clerk stamps a quiet date lightly, politely, and absolutely optional. The gentle secret of history is that commerce learned to sleep better once it could point at something flat and say, this happened and we can go home now. Long before paper, people preferred lumps. In Mesopotamia, small clay tokens stood in for sheep or jars of grain. They were shaped like the things they counted, which is an idea that lasts in children and accountants. A round token meant livestock. A cone meant a measure of barley. When promises had to travel, the tokens went into a hollow clay envelope called a bulla, and the mouth was pressed shut with a seal. A receipt you could not read without breaking. It made honesty feel archaeological. Eventually, the tokens were pressed into the outside of the envelope before it dried, so you could check the count without breaking faith. This was, if you squint, the first itemized list. The clay preferred being a fossil, but it tolerated arithmetic. Elsewhere, ropes and sticks took a turn. In the Andes, knotted cords called quipu recorded counts, with little tufts of numbers arranged like a tidy fringe. You could run your fingers along a cord and feel what was owed. In medieval Europe, the tally stick kept both parties comfortable. A square rod of hazel or willow was notched to show the sum, then split lengthwise so the two halves matched like a quiet divorce. One went with the payer, one with the receiver. When it was time to settle, the halves were reunited, and disagreement had to work very hard. The English exchequer used tallies into the 19th century because old habits do not need calendars. When the government finally burned thousands of them as obsolete, the chimneys at the Houses of Parliament overheated and started a fire that remodeled politics. A receipt can be more ambitious than it looks. Paper moved in with trade, and receipts learned to be rectangles with opinions. In Abbasid Baghdad and Song China, merchants kept waste books, rough logs, written as fast as the day could carry ink. From those, neat copies were copied into ledgers, and small acknowledgments on slips went to customers who wanted to feel squared. Paper had a good bedside manner. It folded, it tucked behind a jar. It rustled. In Italian city-states, notaries taught merchants how to date things in ways that courts would respect. A proper receipt had 3 parts. We received this much, we received it on this day. Later accountants added, we received it for this reason, because reasons age gracefully on paper. The shape is familiar because bureaucracy is surprisingly tender. It likes to hold your hand through an event and then let go. Ink made its own demands. Gall ink, which is iron, salt plus tannin, darkened as it oxidized. A receipt written at noon continued writing itself into evening. Blotting sand mattered. Some shops used a sand shaker that looked like a pepper pot, sprinkling order across vowels. Wax seals joined in, half security and half ceremony. On market days, a receipt might smell faintly of fish, fennel, or the wool of a sheep that took bookkeeping personally. Clerks discovered that handwriting style could speed a queue. A tall loop on the olive lira meant the writer had practiced, and practice meant you'd be home sooner. This is not in the manuals, but it is true that by the 19th century, receipts met machines and learned the rhythm of a crank. The cash register arrived not to count money, but to count honesty. James Riddy, an Ohio saloon keeper with a careful soul, built a device that rang a bell and recorded amounts on a clockwork counter, so his staff had to move through numbers like a train passes stations. Later models printed little strips. Paper rolls were introduced, thin enough to coil, strong enough to endure a drawer's opinions. The standard width's 57 millimeters for small, 80 for grand allowed shops to buy refills without conversation. Somewhere a factory learned to cut paper into long ribbons and roll them so tightly they behaved like polite springs. A clerk could replace a roll by sound. The old one is husky. The new one is bright carbon paper changed the social life of receipts. A sheet dyed with ink and oil sat between 2 pages. Pressure made a copy. It looked like magic, but smelled like insurance. In 1906, chemists Arthur and Edgar Barrett explored microcapsules that would burst under a pen's pressure, releasing color where needed. From this came NCR paper, no carbon required. Here, chemistry went out for tea and returned with convenience. You could write once and get 2 truths, the original and the twin. Restaurants stapled the top, copy to the check spindle, and offered the second to a customer who would fold it into a coat pocket next to a bus ticket and a peppermint that had been there too long. Receipts became dialogues. At the top, a masthead, the shop's name pretending to be a boat. Below, the date, which argued with calendars in multiple dialects, day, month, year for places fond of patience, monthly, year for places fond of shortcuts. Then an index of small events, bread, apples, a sensible length of rope. Each line earned a number, a price, and sometimes a remark. In the margins, Funny little codes that looked like the secret life of typewriters told the register how to tax. Plu 4011 is a banana in more stores than you will visit in a lifetime. Cashiers learned to scan and to tap, to smile, to bag bread on top. The receipt promised to remember what they had done. Thermal paper arrived like a clever cousin. Instead of ink, it carried dye hidden in the paper itself. Under heat, the dye turned dark. The printer head was a bar that grew briefly warm, drawing letters with temperature. No ribbon, no cartridge. Just chemistry waking up. If you listen closely when a receipt prints, the sound is a soft zip the way dew might sound if it decided to take notes. Thermal paper also had a temper. It disliked sunshine and pockets that took too many baths. It changed color when a highlighter insisted on being friendly. Yet it won because it was simple, and simple sleeps well. Stores kept boxes of rolls near the counter like emergency yarn dot microhooks drift across every day at the till. An old regular requests an itemized receipt because his cat collects them. He says this once and then forever. A teenager learns that if a customer asks for a gift receipt, the price disappears like a polite ghost. A manager knows that a refund feels braver if the receipt is unfolded slowly, as if the paper itself were weighing pros and cons. There are the quiet details, the subtotal that pretends not to know the tax that pretends it was inevitable, the total that sits at the bottom like a period. Some printers add a line for rounding, a modern echo of coinage making change with its shoulders. Receipts do far more than prove money moved. They organize time. A shoebox of them can assemble a year from crumbs. Here's the day it rained because the ink bled just a little on the walk home. Here's the month of long receipts and quiet spending because every line says rice, tinned tomatoes, beans, practical foods that know how to wait. Accountants tame these small animals with clips and folders. Archivists freeze them, literally. Cold stops the thermal ink from fading. It also makes you feel like a magician with a library of snow. Museums keep receipts for the steam engine era because sometimes the mundane is the skeleton key to an era's kitchen. Bureaucracy, gentle giant, learned to love the receipt's date. A stamp made it more official, and therefore more restful. Post offices stamped with a satisfying thump that could settle a cough. Libraries adopted date-due slips as little cousins of receipts, gluing them to fly leaves so books could learn punctuality. Passports began to collect stamps with the calm hunger of binders. Even the humble cloakroom ticket is a receipt with stage fright, performing only at reunions of hat and head. Weddings produce receipts in troops' flowers, chairs, a rented optimism about weather. Each scrap offers a small memory theater of totals. Not all receipts are printed. Some are shouted and remembered. In small markets, a vendor may sing a little adding up song, a melody of coins that adds to trust. You pay, they nod. The transaction is stored in both heads, like two halves of a tally stick you can't split. Street vendors write prices in chalk that the rain will edit. A baker keeps a slate behind the counter for customers who will return when the week remembers pay. In some taverns, marks on wood record the number of ales by vertical strokes that gather into groups of 5 like fence posts. These are receipts with legs, prepared to walk away. The line between receipt and advertisement slowly disappeared. You leave this store with a declaration of purchase and a list of things you did not buy but could. Next time, perhaps on Thursday. Coupons dangle at the bottom like a tail with suggestions. $2 off wiper blades. Buy one, get one detergent. The paper itself proposes a future. Some receipts include surveys and promise entry into a sweepstake with the air of a friend who keeps telling you about a very good game of bingo. The survey code looks like a poem written by a calculator. You put it in your pocket anyway, because pockets do not judge. There's humor around the edges. A small grocer prints, at the top of every receipt, Thank you for shopping today, as if yesterday were still uncommitted. A hardware store includes saw rental in a font that looks slightly nervous. A cafe uses receipts as order slips that cling to cups with a weak adhesive that has the life goals of a leaf. A barbecue place prints meat served until we run out, which is both honest and philosophical. The customer finishing a mountain of fries folds the receipt into a tiny boat and sails it across the ketchup sea, until a napkin becomes an island and gravity becomes a law again. When receipts meet taxes, the romance grows quiet and practical. People sort them by category. They learn the difference between a deductible and a nice story. There are envelopes labeled fuel and lunches and seasonal, which is a word that shelters many little excuses. A good habit is to write Y on the back while the Y is fresh. Bus ticket to client, candles for office morale. Later, the pencil note will save an argument and a memory. The most sensible accountants advise photographing receipts as soon as they hatch, because light is a long appointment and paper prefers to nap, dot, and chops. The ritual of asking the question, receipt with you or in the bag, is the quiet coda to commerce. Some customers hold out a hand without looking, as if the paper were a bird that knows where to land. Some decline with a small wave, a gesture that means, I believe we will remember this, and if we do not, we will improvise. A few say, email it, and the receipt joins a cloud that stores promises at room temperature. Digital receipts are tidy. They sort themselves, they do not crumple, they do not fraternize with gum, but they cannot be used as an emergency bookmark or a test strip to see if a frying pan is hot. Paper has its modest superheroics. Thermal printers do have their lure. If the print is faint, the head needs cleaning with a little isopropyl on a cotton swab, as if you were reassuring a shy piano. If the paper shows dark patches along the left edge, the feed roller has picked up dust from a flour-heavy morning. Rolls are loaded so the glossy side faces the heat. If the text appears invisible, you have accidentally taught the printer to draw on the wrong side of the moon. Clerks learn to tear at a slight angle for a crisp edge. A perfect rip is a small triumph that will never attend an award ceremony. Receipts also prove absence. The void receipt is a pale ghost that testifies nothing happened here after all. Returns generate exchanges with negative quantities, which look like apologies wearing numbers. Auditors, benevolent or not, can reconstruct a day from the shape of voids alone. It is possible, if you truly want to sleep, to study the timestamp drift of a register that was never set after a power outage. For 2 months, the afternoon thinks it is dawn. Only the receipt cares. It fixes the day with its little numerals and does not press the point. There have been moments when receipts became politics. Ration books in wartime were receipts that told the future how much of the present it could borrow. Bread, fuel, sugar each, a tiny permission. People learn to count carefully and to trade stamps for neighbors' needs. Gasoline coupons tucked into glove compartments like patient birds. In post-war shops, the habit of taking receipts stayed even when the coupons walked off the stage. The paper remained calm and rectangular, softly stating that order had resumed and would like to continue. Receipts age into delicate artifacts. Their totals swim towards sepia. The heat of a wallet persuades lines to fade like sun on a picnic table. A trick exists, whispered by librarians. Place the receipt in the freezer. Cold slows forgetting. Another, scan with a blue light. Faint print often pops back like a shy autograph. The best trick is the oldest. Copy the information while the ink is young. Historians know that every day is a little museum and in every pocket a drawer. Receipts, with their dates and footers, make the small museum tidy enough to dust. There are specialist receipts with careers of their own. Pharmacy slips repeat warnings in tiny paragraphs that could tuck a city into bed. Take with water. Avoid operating heavy machinery. Avoid mixing with advice from cousins. Parking receipts combine time and geography in a crisp duet, telling a meter when it can relax. Toll road receipts are brief, like a nod between bridges. Laundries issue small tickets perforated like hopeful stamps, matching garments to owners with numeric sympathy. In tailor shops, a receipt may include a sketch of your sleeve. A quiet compliment, we noticed you. Some of the strangest receipts arrive long after the event, the automatic ones from subscription services that renew invisibly at dawn. Their subject line is serene. Your plan has renewed. It is the modern equivalent of the night watch calling the hour. We are still here. We have charged you kindly. Go back to sleep. And we do, mostly after storing the message for later and then forgetting where we put later. Even that is a function. Receipts keep a second brain for us because the first doesn't always pick up dot at closing time. A shop's receipt printer performs a gentle opera called the Z Report. It prints totals for the day. Not just money, but types of payment, refunds, discounts, loyalty points that have agreed to move from intention to effect. The long ribbon curls into a pale spiral that looks like a sleeping snail. The manager signs the bottom with a pen that has developed opinions about gravity. The register breathes out, the lights dim, and the machines talk among themselves in tiny clicks. Somewhere, a roll is changed for the morning. The end of a day is also the beginning of the next receipt. If there is a philosophy to all of this, it is not complicated. A receipt is a way of telling the past to behave itself. It is a bookmark in a public book. It says, we met here, we traded here, we were civil and mostly accurate. It allows both parties to forget deliberately, because forgetting without records is anxiety, and forgetting with records is rest. The quiet comedy is that we still tuck these proofs into wallets, as if pockets were archives and laundry were not an editor. Still, most of the time, it works. When a guarantee needs proof, the crumpled slip emerges like a veteran and clears its throat. Late at night, when shops sleep and only the fridge hums in the back, the little printer rests with the last receipt still warm in its mouth. The paper holds today in numbers so small that they look like arrangement rather than opinion. On some counter, a customer has left a receipt folded into a narrow accordion that will later expand like a yawn. In a coat pocket, another rides home next to a coin, both keeping the other from being lonely. And somewhere in a drawer, a shoebox has begun another layer of thin memories, the layered sediment of small days, stacked by date and gradually lightening to gray. Morning will come with a bell, a beep, a door chime that believes in optimism. Someone will buy bread and the printer will whisper again, taking the day's first breath. Paper will slide forward, sliced on the little metal tooth into a neat edge. The clerk will offer it with a question that is older than it sounds paper or piece. And the customer will choose, and commerce will exhale. The slip will travel to a pocket, a bag, a trash can, a file, a tax folder, a freezer, a shoebox, a memory. The proof will sit there, simple as a rectangle, quiet as the pause between totals. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it settling in, a tiny affirmation that the day has been counted and can now drift toward sleep.